Before the first motorway was built, before the supermarket existed, before the word mortgage became something that kept people awake at night, a man woke up at 4 in the morning, loaded glass bottles onto an electric float, and delivered milk to every street in his town before most people had eaten breakfast. He owned his house. He ran a car. Every summer, he packed his family into that car and drove to the sea for a week. He was not a manager. He was not a professional. He had no degree, no investment portfolio, and no wealthy family behind him. He was a milkman. And the question of how an ordinary man doing an ordinary job could afford those three things, the house, the car, the holiday, on a manual wage, is not a question about nostalgia. It is not a question about a simpler time that could never come back. It is a question about exactly what was built, exactly how it was taken apart, and exactly who decided to take it apart. Section 1. The wage floor that actually existed. Monday morning, 5 o'clock. Britain is still dark. A man climbs out of bed before his family stirs, pulls on his work clothes, and walks out to a vehicle already loaded with glass bottles of milk. He will be done before most of the street has eaten breakfast. He will have spoken to more neighbors in one morning than most office workers will speak to in a week. And at the end of the month, after he has paid his mortgage, filled the tank of his car, and set aside money for the family holiday, there will still be something left over. This is not a story about a lucky man. This is not a story about an exceptional man. This is a story about ordinary working life in Britain in the 1960s, and about the specific conditions that made that ordinary life possible. The milkman did not win the lottery. He did not inherit wealth. He did not climb a corporate ladder or earn a degree. He drove a route, delivered milk, collected payment, and came home. And with that wage, that ordinary, manual, working-class wage, he could afford a house, a car, and a week by the sea. Today, that combination sounds almost impossible for a worker at his level. Back then, it was simply Tuesday. To understand how that was possible, the first thing to understand is what wages actually looked like in 1960, and more importantly, what those wages could actually buy. In 1960, the average male manual worker in Britain took home £14 per week. That works out to £728 a year. These figures come from the Office for National Statistics' New Earnings Survey, one of the most reliable records of what British workers were actually paid. By 1968, that same average manual wage had climbed to £22 per week, £1,144 a year. In 8 years, the weekly wage of a working man had grown by more than 50%. Now those numbers, written out like that, look small. £14 a week sounds like almost nothing, and measured in today's prices, it is not a large sum. But measuring 1960 wages in today's prices and comparing them to today's costs tells only half the story, and the less interesting half at that. The question that matters is not how big the number was. The question is what the number could do. In 1960, the average house in Britain cost £2,263. The average manual worker earned £728 a year. That means a house cost roughly 3 years of a working man's salary. Not 3 years of saving every single penny he earned, 3 years of total gross income. The mortgage payments on a house at that price, on the lending terms that building societies offered in the 1960s, were manageable on a single income. Not comfortable in the way that people use the word today. Not luxurious, but manageable. A man could look at his wage packet, look at what a house cost, and see a path from one to the other that did not require 2 incomes, a decade of saving, or the kind of help from family that most working-class families simply did not have to give. That relationship between wages and house prices, 3 to 3.5 times annual salary, held steady across the whole of the 1950s and 1960s. It was not a fluke of one particular year. It was the normal condition of the British housing market during that period. And behind that stability was a deliberate set of policies. Mortgage lending was tightly controlled. Banks and building societies were not allowed to lend freely. The government set limits on how much could be lent and on what terms. The result was that house prices could not shoot upward the way they would later, because the fuel that drives house prices, cheap and easy credit, was kept under control. Compare that to today. By 2024, the ratio of house prices to average earnings had reached roughly 8 times annual salary. A worker today has to earn twice as many years' worth of wages to afford the same basic thing, a roof over their head, that their grandfather bought on a £14 weekly wage. That single shift, more than almost anything else, explains why the milkman's world feels so distant. But wages and house prices are only part of the picture. The deeper question is why wages in the 1960s actually had purchasing power, why a manual worker's pay went as far as it did, and why the people at the bottom of the labor market were not simply left behind by the growth happening around them. The answer to that question sits in the structure of the 1960s economy itself. GDP growth across the 1960s averaged 3.5% a year. Unemployment averaged 2.7%, a figure so low by modern standards that economists today would struggle to believe it was sustained across a full decade. Inflation averaged 3.5%, which sounds worrying until measured against wage growth, which consistently outpaced it. The result was that real wages measured against the actual cost of living, not just the number on the pay packet, grew by 3% a year through the 1960s. 3% annual real wage growth held steady for a decade. It has never been sustained at that level since. In the 2010s and early 2020s, real wages in Britain showed no growth at all, the longest period of real wage stagnation in the 160 years for which comparable records exist. The 1960s were not normal, in other words. They were an exception, a window, a period in which the specific conditions of the British and global economy combined to produce something that workers at the bottom of the income scale had rarely experienced before and have not reliably experienced since. Wages that grew faster than the cost of living year after year for a full decade. Part of what kept that growth going was full employment. In the 1960s, there were not enough workers to fill available jobs. Labor shortages in manufacturing and transport were severe enough that the government actively encouraged immigration from Commonwealth countries to fill the gap. When workers are scarce, employers must pay more to attract and keep them. When workers are plentiful, employers can pay less, and workers have little choice but to accept it. The 1960s were, structurally, a workers' market in a way that has rarely been true in Britain since. The welfare state also played a role that is easy to underestimate. The National Health Service meant that a working family did not need to budget for medical emergencies. Council housing meant that even families who had not yet managed to buy had access to decent, affordable rented accommodation, not as a safety net for the desperate, but as a mainstream option that a significant share of the population used. In 1961, there were 5 million council homes in Britain. That stock did not disappear until the 1980s, when a government policy sold it off at a discount and stopped building replacements. But in the 1960s, it was there, a floor beneath the working class that kept their basic costs manageable and left more of their wages free to spend on other things. Then there is the matter of how wages were set. In the 1960s, trade union membership was high, and collective bargaining was the dominant way that pay was decided across most of British industry. Industry-wide wage agreements meant that employers across an entire sector, all the engineering firms, all the transport companies, paid broadly the same rates. Workers did not negotiate individually, which would have left each one vulnerable to being undercut. They negotiated collectively, which meant that a worker in a low-skill or low-status job still had the weight of his entire industry behind him when his wage was set. The milkman's wage was not set by what one dairy could get away with paying. It was set within a structure that connected his pay to the broader conditions of the labor market and the general direction of the economy. When the economy grew, working men felt it, not immediately, and not always fairly. But the mechanism existed to translate growth at the top of the economy into wages at the bottom. That mechanism has been progressively weakened in the decades since. By the time real wage stagnation set in after 2008, the average weekly wage of a British worker was 4.2 times higher in cash terms than it had been in 1963. That sounds like progress, but in that same period, house prices rose by many times more than wages. The cost of childcare, university education, and private transport rose far faster than wages. The NHS, still free at the point of use, came under increasing strain, and the council housing stock that had provided a floor beneath working-class costs in the 1960s had been reduced from 5 million homes to 1.7 million, a level last seen in 1961, before the big building programs of the following 2 decades had filled out that safety net. The milkman of the 1960s was not richer in cash terms than his grandchildren are today. In cash, he was much poorer, but he lived inside a set of conditions: controlled house prices, full employment, collective wage bargaining, a full stock of affordable council housing, a health service that removed medical costs from the household budget. That meant his £14 a week went further toward the basics of a stable life than many times that amount does today. He could afford the house because houses were priced at 3 times his annual salary, lending was controlled, and a building society would give him a mortgage on a single income. He could afford the car because small family cars cost less than a year's wages, and real wages grew every year. He could afford the holiday because paid leave was a legal right. Holiday camps were priced at a week's wages, and the cost of the week away did not have to compete with a mortgage that cost 8 times his annual salary to service. This is the foundation. The wage floor of the 1960s was not simply a number on a pay packet, it was a wage floor embedded in a complete economic system: full employment, price-controlled housing, collective bargaining, and a welfare state that removed the most catastrophic costs from ordinary family life. Strip away any one of those components and the milkman's life becomes harder. Strip away all of them, one by one, across 50 years, and his grandchild, doing a similar job, cannot afford to live where he grew up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question of how that stripping happened and what the first cracks looked like when they appeared begins with the price of the one thing the milkman carried on his float every morning: milk, and what the government did and stopped doing to control it. Section 2. The price of a house and what it actually cost a working man. In the summer of 1962, a Ford Cortina rolled off the production line at Ford's factory in Dagenham, Essex for the first time. It cost £573. That same year, a 3-bedroom semi-detached house on a new estate in North Yorkshire sold for £2,300. A man earning the average manual wage of around £14 a week would have needed to save for roughly 3 years of total earnings to buy that house outright. He did not need to save 3 years outright. He needed a deposit, a portion of the price up front, and then a mortgage from a building society to cover the rest. And on a £14 weekly wage, in 1962, that mortgage was something a single working man could carry. That is the central fact of 1960s housing in Britain. Not that houses were free, not that working men were wealthy, but that the gap between what a working man earned and what a house cost was small enough that one income, steadily applied, could close it. The average house price in Britain in 1960 was £2,263. The average annual salary for a male manual worker that same year was £728. That puts the house at roughly 3 times the annual wage, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less depending on the region and the type of property. But across the decade, house prices held at roughly 2.5 to 3.5 times what a working man earned in a year. This ratio held because of something specific that is not often explained when people talk about 1960s housing. Mortgage lending in Britain during the 1950s and 1960s was tightly controlled by the government. Banks and building societies operated under direct limits on how much they could lend and to whom. They were not free to offer whatever terms attracted the most customers. The government set ceilings. The result was that the fuel which later drove house prices into the stratosphere, large amounts of cheap and easy borrowing, was kept under strict control. When borrowing is controlled, buyers cannot simply outbid each other by taking on bigger and bigger loans. Prices stay connected to what people can actually afford to repay on their actual wages. The 1960s housing market was anchored to the reality of what working people earned, because the rules of lending forced that anchor to hold. Building societies, which were the main source of mortgages for ordinary working families in Britain, typically lent around 2.5 to 3 times a borrower's annual income. They considered only the husband's income in most cases, not his wife's. They required a deposit, usually around 10% of the purchase price. They offered mortgage terms of around 15 to 20 years. These were not generous terms. Monthly payments on a 15-year mortgage were heavier than on a 25-year mortgage. But the house was paid off sooner, and the total amount repaid over the life of the loan was substantially less. A man earning £14 a week, £728 a year, could reasonably expect a building society to lend him somewhere between £1,800 and £2,200. A house costing £2,263 required a deposit of around £200 to £250. Save that deposit, secure the mortgage, and the house was his. The monthly payments would be tight. There would not be a great deal of money left over. But the mortgage payments on a home of that price, at the interest rates and lending terms of the early 1960s, were within the reach of a single income at the manual working level. This was not an accident of history. It was a policy outcome. The government made choices about how much lenders could lend, about how much housing to build, about how much council housing to maintain, that kept the relationship between wages and house prices in a range that ordinary working families could navigate. The 1960s also saw an enormous amount of house building. The post-war government had committed to a massive program of building new homes, both for purchase and for rent through local councils. By 1968, Britain was completing over 425,000 new homes in a single year, a record that has never been beaten. That volume of supply mattered. When houses are being built in large numbers, prices cannot rise as fast as they do when supply is restricted. The 1960s were a decade of genuine, sustained house building, and that kept prices anchored to what people could actually afford. The council housing stock played a role in this that goes beyond the people who lived in council houses. By the early 1960s, the council housing stock in Britain stood at 5 million homes. This was not a small or marginal part of the market. It was a mainstream option. Roughly a third of all housing in Britain was publicly owned and rented at below-market rates to ordinary working families. This is relevant to house prices in the private market because it created competition. If council rents were low and council housing was decent, private landlords could not charge whatever they liked for private rentals. The presence of a large, affordable, publicly owned housing stock put a ceiling on what private accommodation could cost, which in turn affected the overall housing costs that working families faced. A milkman who had not yet saved enough for a mortgage deposit did not face the choice between an unaffordable private rent and homelessness. He could apply for a council house. He might wait. In many areas, the waiting list was long, but the option existed, and it was a real one. Many working families moved through a progression. Council house first, save the deposit over several years, then buy. The council stock was the platform from which owner-occupation became possible for people who had started with nothing. Now look at what happened to all of this. House prices began to pull away from wages toward the end of the 1960s and through the 1970s. The tight controls on mortgage lending started to ease. Credit became more freely available. As more money chased a limited number of homes, prices rose. By 1970, the average house price had already climbed to £4,480. That is almost double what it had been just 10 years earlier, while wages had not come close to doubling in the same period. The ratio that had held steady at 2.5 to 3.5 times annual earnings started to stretch. By the early 1970s, homes in Britain could still be bought for less than 5 times average annual earnings. That was already a deterioration from the 1960s, but it was still manageable. Then the ratio kept climbing. Through the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s, it climbed further, pausing briefly after crashes before resuming its upward direction. By 2024, the average house price in Britain stood at around £274,000. The average annual salary for a full-time worker was roughly £35,000. That is a ratio of nearly 8 times annual earnings. A working man today must accumulate nearly 8 years of total gross income to buy the average house. His grandfather needed to accumulate 3. That is not a small change. That is a transformation of the most basic economic relationship in ordinary life, the relationship between the work a person does and the roof they can put over their head. The Right to Buy scheme, introduced in 1980, made this transformation significantly worse in a specific way. It allowed council tenants to buy their homes at a substantial discount. More than 1.5 million council homes were sold in this way between 1980 and 1995. The homes that were sold were the better ones, the solid houses with gardens, in decent neighborhoods. The homes that were not sold were often the ones nobody wanted to buy. And crucially, the law that allowed the sell-off did not require councils to replace what was sold. The 5 million council homes of 1961 shrank to 1.7 million by the time the damage was fully counted. That is a level last seen in 1961, before 2 decades of building had created that safety net in the first place. The floor beneath working-class housing costs was pulled away. Private rents rose. The competition that publicly owned housing had created against the private market disappeared. And all of this happened at exactly the same time that house prices in the ownership market were rising to levels that made buying increasingly impossible for people on ordinary wages. The milkman of the 1960s stood at the beginning of this process, not the end of it. He bought his house when the ratio was 3 times his annual wage, and his building society would lend him the money on a single income. The world he lived in had been constructed, deliberately, by people who believed that housing should be within reach of the working population, and who used the tools of government, lending controls, public building programs, affordable council housing, to make it so. Those tools were not permanent, they were policy choices. And policy choices can be reversed. What makes this history particularly striking is how quickly the reversal happened after it began. The 1960s house price ratio of 3 times annual wages had lasted through the whole of the post-war period. The climb from 3 times to 8 times happened in roughly 50 years, driven not by any single dramatic event, but by the steady withdrawal of the conditions that had kept prices down: easing of lending controls, reduction of house building, sell-off of the council stock, and the growth of a financial system that encouraged people to see houses not as homes but as investments. When a house is a home, its price is connected to what people earn and what they can afford to pay. When a house is an investment, its price is connected to what buyers expect it to be worth in the future, and that number has no ceiling, because the expectation of future growth always pushes the current price higher. The milkman bought a home. His grandchild is expected to buy an investment vehicle while also somehow living in it. The mathematics of those two things are completely different. What kept the milkman's house affordable, in the end, was that the government of his time treated housing as a basic need to be provided within the reach of working people, and built and regulated and controlled accordingly. The moment that framing was replaced by a different one, housing as a market commodity, prices set by whatever the credit system would support, the affordability of the 1960s became a memory rather than a policy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The house was one pillar of the milkman's life. The car was another. And the story of how an ordinary working man came to afford a new family car on a manual wage turns out to involve exactly the same kind of structural thinking. Prices anchored to what working people could actually earn, in a market that had not yet been handed over entirely to the logic of maximum extraction. Section 3, The Milkman's Round, What the Job Actually Was. The alarm went off at 4 in the morning, not 5, not 4:30, 4 o'clock, in the dark, in every season, in every weather. While the rest of the street slept, the milkman was already moving. He had a float to load, a route to cover, and a rhythm to maintain that had been set long before he arrived and would continue long after he left for the day. By the time most families sat down to breakfast, he had already walked several miles, lifted hundreds of bottles, and exchanged more words with more people than most workers would manage in a full office shift. This was not glamorous work. Nobody pretended it was. The hours were unsociable, the physical load was real, and the British weather made no allowances for the man delivering milk in January at 4:30 in the morning. But the job had something that many workers today would recognize as remarkable the moment they heard it described. It was stable, it was permanent, it was respected, and it paid enough, week after week, year after year, to build a life on. To understand why the milkman's round was what it was in the 1960s, and why that job carried the economic weight it did, the first thing to understand is the sheer scale of the industry surrounding it. In 1966, around 100,000 people worked in the supply of milk in Britain. This was not a niche trade. It was a major industry, employing as many people as some of the largest manufacturing sectors of the era. The milkman himself was the visible end of a supply chain that ran from dairy farms across the country, through processing plants, into depots, and out onto the roads every morning before dawn. The man on the float was the final link in a chain involving tens of thousands of workers, hundreds of thousands of cows, and a logistical operation that covered virtually every street in every town and city in Britain. Until the mid-1960s, milk was delivered 7 days a week. Every morning, without exception, the float came. This changed in October 1964, when the standard working week shifted from 48 hours to 40 hours and 5 days, making the 7-day delivery schedule harder to maintain. But even after that, the deliveries continued 6 days a week in most areas, and the round remained the backbone of how Britain got its milk. By 1975, 94% of all milk sold in Britain came in glass bottles. The glass bottle on the doorstep was not just an image from nostalgia, it was a statistical reality. Virtually every household in the country received milk this way. The milkman was not providing a specialist service for a particular type of customer. He was providing the primary means by which Britain fed itself its morning milk. His route was essential infrastructure. The milk float itself is worth a moment. The vehicle the milkman drove was electric, battery-powered, quiet, and slow. Its quietness was part of the design. A petrol engine running through residential streets at 4:30 in the morning would wake the neighborhood. The float was built to move silently, or as close to silently as its load of glass bottles would allow. The clink of glass bottles in a crate became one of the defining sounds of British morning life in the 20th century, familiar enough that most people did not register it as they slept through it, but missed immediately the moment it was gone. The route itself was known as a round. Each milkman had his own round, a set of streets and houses that were his responsibility. A round in a busy urban area might cover several hundred households. The milkman knew each one. He knew who took 2 pints of full fat and who took 1 pint of semi-skimmed. He knew who had recently had a baby and needed an extra pint. He knew which elderly residents were on their own, and he knew what it meant if the bottles from the previous morning had not been taken in. Many milkmen checked on elderly customers as a matter of course, not because anyone told them to, but because the daily contact made it natural. He was, in the most literal sense, a regular presence in the lives of the people on his round. At the end of the week, the milkman collected payment. He knocked on each door, noted what had been delivered, took the money, gave change, and moved on. This weekly collection was more than a transaction. It was a conversation. People invited him in for a cup of tea. They told him what was happening in their lives. They asked after his family. He became, over years and decades of the same route, something between a service worker and a familiar face. Many milkmen spent 30 to 40 years on the same round, watching the children on their route grow up and have children of their own. This social dimension of the job was not incidental. It was part of what made the milkman's role in the community so significant. He was one of the few people in any neighborhood who moved through it every single day, who had a reason to be on every doorstep, and who had the time and the habit of brief human contact built into the structure of his working morning. In an era before the internet, before mobile phones, and before the kind of hyper-connected isolation that now passes for modern life, the milkman was a genuine node of community connection. Beyond milk, the round gradually expanded to include other goods. Butter and cheese were common additions. Some milkmen delivered eggs, others carried cream. The float became a small mobile shop, and the milkman became the deliverer of a broader range of dairy goods as the decades progressed. This expansion of product range was partly commercial. More goods meant more income per customer, and partly a response to the trust that customers had built up with their regular milkman. If he was there every day and they trusted him with their milk order, extending that trust to a block of butter required very little persuasion. The income structure of the round is important to understand because it was not simply a flat hourly wage. The milkman's earnings came from a combination of his basic wage from the dairy that employed him and the commissions or payments he received based on his route. In many cases, long-serving milkmen were able to build up a round that generated a reliable and decent income, particularly as they added customers and expanded their product range. Tips at Christmas were also significant. A milkman who had been on the same round for several years and had genuine relationships with his customers could expect a meaningful addition to his income in December from households that valued the daily service he provided. The total package, basic wage, round income, and Christmas tips, put a good milkman comfortably into the range of the average manual wage for the era. The average male manual wage in 1960 was £14 a week. In many cases, an established milkman with a solid round was earning at or above that level. The work was physically demanding and the hours were antisocial, but the combination of job security, community connection, and an income that actually met the costs of ordinary life made the milkman's position one that men stayed in for decades. A career of 30 to 40 years on the same round was not unusual. People did not leave a job like that when it worked. Job security in the 1960s dairy industry was real in a way that is worth explaining carefully. The Milk Marketing Board, a government body established in 1933, controlled the price of milk at both the farm level and the retail level. Because the price of milk was set by the board rather than by competition between dairies, the economic conditions of the dairy industry were stable and predictable in a way that would be impossible to recreate today. Dairies knew what they would receive for their milk. They could plan their staffing, their routes, and their wage bills accordingly. The milkman's job was protected from the kind of sudden price collapse that would later devastate the dairy industry when the board was abolished and supermarkets were free to sell milk at whatever price they chose. This price protection flowed down the chain. Stable dairy revenues meant stable dairy wages. Stable dairy wages meant a milkman could plan. He could take out a mortgage because he knew what he would earn next year. He could buy a car on a payment plan because he knew the payments would be met. He could book a holiday because the week's wages would still be coming in when he got back. The physical structure of the round also gave the milkman something that many workers in the modern economy have lost entirely: autonomy over his working day. Once he had loaded his float and left the depot, he was largely his own boss until the round was finished. He set his own pace within the constraints of the route. He made his own decisions about the order in which he covered streets. He managed his own customer relationships. He was not supervised minute by minute. He was trusted to do his job, and he did it. This combination of physical work, community connection, and daily autonomy made the milkman's round a more satisfying job than its early hours and physical demands might suggest from the outside. In 1989, 15 million homes in Britain were served by 34,000 milkmen. That was already a substantial decline from the peak years of the 1960s, but it still represents an industry covering an enormous portion of the population. The figure matters because it shows how durable the milkman's role proved to be, even as other forces began to work against it. The round survived the arrival of the first supermarkets, the expansion of home refrigerators, and the early growth of packaged milk in cartons. It survived because the service it provided, fresh milk on the doorstep every morning, collected the previous evening, paid for weekly, was genuinely useful to the people who received it, and because the price structure around it, controlled by the government, kept the milkman competitive. What ended it, eventually, was not that the service became less useful. The service remained useful. What ended it was that the price protection was removed. The supermarkets were allowed to sell milk at below-cost prices as a way of drawing customers into their stores, and the milkman found himself competing against a machine that was specifically designed to undercut him. The 8% of milk now delivered to the door, down from 86% in the early 1980s, is the measure of what that competition produced. But that is the ending of the story, not its middle. In the 1960s, at the peak of the golden age of milk delivery, the milkman's round was a functioning, stable, well-embedded institution. 100,000 workers. Virtually universal household coverage. A government-controlled price that kept the industry viable. A social role that extended far beyond the delivery of a perishable liquid. And a wage structure that, sitting inside the broader economic conditions of the 1960s, was enough to buy a house, run a car, and take a family to the seaside for a week each year. The round worked because everything around it worked. The wages made sense because the house prices made sense. The job security was real because the price structure was protected. The community role was possible because the daily contact of the round built genuine relationships over years and decades. This is the shape of what was lost. Not just the milk delivery itself, but the entire ecosystem that made the milkman's life possible. A protected industry sitting inside a protected economy, inside a housing market that kept prices connected to wages, inside a full employment labor market that kept wages rising every year. Each piece of that ecosystem depended on the others, which makes the question of how it came apart particularly important. And the piece that came apart first, the piece that sits at the very foundation of everything the milkman's working life rested on, was not the supermarket. The supermarket was visible. The supermarket was the thing people could see and point to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The piece that came apart first was invisible. It was a government board that most people had never heard of, controlling a price that most people took for granted. And what happened when that board was finally dismantled reveals something essential about how the world the milkman lived in was built, and why, once the building was taken apart, it could not be put back together. Section 4. The Milk Marketing Board, the invisible floor beneath every round. In October 1994, a government body that most British people had never heard of closed its doors for the last time. Its headquarters had been at Thames Ditton in Surrey. Its workforce at peak operation numbered 7,000 employees spread across England and Wales. It had maintained stable economic conditions for up to 70,000 independent dairy farms. It had controlled the price of milk for 6 decades. And when it was gone, the dairy industry began a slow collapse that would eventually drive thousands of farms out of business, cut the price paid to farmers by 28%, and reduce doorstep milk delivery from a near-universal service to a tiny niche covering roughly 3% of households. The body was called the Milk Marketing Board, and understanding what it did, why it existed, and what happened when it was removed is essential to understanding why the milkman of the 1960s could afford the life he lived. The Milk Marketing Board was created in 1933. Britain at that time was in the grip of the Great Depression. Dairy farmers across the country were struggling to survive. The problem was structural. Milk is a perishable product. A farmer who produces milk has no choice but to sell it quickly. He cannot warehouse it and wait for prices to improve the way a manufacturer of durable goods might. Every morning, the cows produce milk whether the market wants it or not. If the buyer offers a low price, the farmer must either accept it or pour the milk away. The buyer knows this. And in a free market, where farmers are competing against each other and each one faces the same daily pressure to sell before the milk spoils, buyers can drive prices down as far as they choose. By 1933, dairy farmers in Britain were being paid prices that barely covered the cost of production, and in many cases did not cover it at all. Farms were failing. Rural communities were collapsing. The government of the time decided to intervene. The mechanism it chose was a marketing board, a body that would act as the buyer of all milk produced in England and Wales, and then sell it on at a controlled price. Every dairy farmer registered with the board. Every morning, the milk they produced was sold to the board at a guaranteed minimum price. The board then sold that milk to dairies, processors, and ultimately to the consumer. The retail price of milk was controlled. The farm gate price was guaranteed. The entire chain from cow to doorstep operated within a system of price management that removed the worst effects of market competition from the most vulnerable points in the chain. This is the structure that sat beneath the milkman's working life in the 1960s, though most milkmen would not have been able to describe it in these terms. What they knew, practically, was that the price of milk was fixed. A pint of milk cost what it cost, and neither the milkman nor his customers could change that. When it came to competing for customers on his round, the milkman had no price lever to pull. He could not undercut a rival by charging less per pint, because the price was the same everywhere. What he competed on was service, reliability, friendliness, the extra products he carried, the relationships he built. This fixed price structure gave the entire dairy supply chain something it had never had before 1933 and has never fully recovered since 1994: predictability. Dairies knew what they would pay for raw milk. They knew what they could charge at retail. They could plan their staffing, their vehicle fleets, and their wage bills years in advance. The milkman's employer knew, with reasonable certainty, what the business would earn next year. That certainty flowed directly into the milkman's wage and job security. In practical terms, this meant that the milkman could go to a building society and apply for a mortgage with a level of confidence that would be extraordinary by modern standards. He could tell the building society what he earned, and both he and they could be reasonably confident that he would still be earning roughly that amount in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years. The industry he worked in was not subject to the kind of sudden price collapses that force employers to cut wages or shed workers overnight. The floor beneath his income was real, and it had been put there deliberately. The board maintained stable economic conditions for up to 70,000 independent farms across England and Wales. These were not large industrial operations. The average dairy herd size in 1954 was just 16 cows, and a herd of that size could comfortably support 3 families. These were small, family-run farms producing modest volumes of milk and selling every drop to the board at a guaranteed price. The board was the reason those farms could exist at all. Without the guaranteed minimum price, the economics of a 16-cow dairy farm in rural Britain would have been impossible from the start. By 1950, milk producer numbers in England and Wales had peaked at around 162,000 registered farms. That is the high watermark of British dairy farming. It was reached because the board had made it economically viable to be a small dairy farmer in Britain. After 1950, the numbers began to fall as farm sizes increased and the economics of scale took effect, but the board continued to provide the price floor that kept the remaining farms financially stable. The board also played a role that went beyond simply buying and selling milk. It funded research into milk production. It promoted milk consumption through advertising campaigns. In 1958, it began sponsoring the Tour of Britain cycling race, known as the Milk Race, as part of its promotional work. It was used as a model by other countries looking to stabilize their own agricultural industries. In 1962, agricultural officials from India visited London to study the board's structure. It was, by any measure, one of the most successful pieces of agricultural policy in British history. The government retained a close relationship with the board throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. The Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food controlled the retail price and guaranteed price of milk even after wartime rationing ended in 1953. The price that a family paid for a pint of milk on their doorstep was a government decision, not a market outcome. This is a fact that is easy to overlook when looking back on the 1960s from the present, when the idea of the government setting the price of a basic food feels unusual. In the 1960s, it was the normal operating condition of one of Britain's most important food industries. What this meant for the milkman, concretely, was that his income was underwritten by a chain of guaranteed prices running all the way back to the farm. The dairy that employed him paid a controlled price for raw milk. It charged a controlled price for delivered milk. Its margins were predictable. Its ability to pay its workforce a stable wage was protected. And the government, through its control of both the farm gate price and the retail price, was actively choosing to make that stability possible. The argument that eventually ended the board was that it was a monopoly. Larger farms and some commercial dairies disliked the fact that the board controlled all milk sales and that prices were fixed rather than set by competition. The argument was that a free market would be more efficient, that competition between buyers would drive innovation, that prices would find their natural level, and that the best farmers and the best dairies would thrive while the rest adapted or left. What actually happened when the board was abolished in October 1994 was different from what the argument promised. Without the board as the guaranteed buyer of last resort, individual farms were left to negotiate their own contracts with dairy processors and supermarkets. A single dairy farm negotiating with a major supermarket chain is not an equal negotiation. The supermarket buys milk from dozens of farms. The farm can only sell milk to a small number of processors. The processor has options. The farm does not. The supermarket sets the terms, and if the price it offers does not cover the farmer's production costs, the farmer either accepts the loss or exits the industry. Supermarkets discovered in the years after 1994 that milk was a product they could use to attract customers. If a supermarket could sell a 4-pint container of milk cheaper than a customer could buy an equivalent amount from their milkman, the customer would come to the supermarket, and while there, they would also buy bread, vegetables, cleaning products, and everything else the supermarket carried. The milk itself could be sold at a loss or at minimal profit, because the purpose of the cheap milk was not to make money on the milk. The purpose was to bring people through the door. The milkman could not compete with this. He was selling milk, and only milk plus a small range of other dairy goods. He had no other products whose profits could subsidize a below-cost milk price. If the supermarket sold milk cheaper than he did, he lost customers. He had no answer to it. By the time the full impact of this competition was felt, doorstep delivery had collapsed from covering 86% of milk sales in the early 1980s to covering just 3% by the 2010s. The 34,000 milkmen of 1989 became a fraction of that number within 2 decades. The 100,000 workers employed in the supply of milk in 1966 became a memory. The farms followed the same path. Milk prices paid to farmers fell by 28% in the years following the abolition of the board. Farms that had been viable under the guaranteed price system found themselves unable to cover their costs. The number of dairy farms in England and Wales, which had peaked at 162,000 in 1950, fell continuously through the following decades, and the pace of that fall accelerated sharply after 1994. It costs a farmer around 30 to 32 pence per liter to produce milk. In recent years, supermarkets have sold milk cheaper than bottled water. The gap between what it costs to produce milk and what supermarkets pay for it has, at various points since 1994, been negative, meaning farmers were being paid less than it cost them to produce what they were selling. This is the direct consequence of removing the price floor that the board had maintained for 60 years. The milkman of the 1960s worked in an industry where the price of the product he delivered had been set by the government to be high enough to sustain the farms that produced it, the dairies that processed it, and the workers who delivered it. That price was not set by what the market would bear at its lowest point. It was set by what the industry needed to function sustainably. This is a different principle from the one that governs the modern food market, and the difference between those two principles is visible in the trajectory of the dairy industry over the 60 years that followed. The board was not perfect. No institution is. Larger farms had legitimate grievances about the limits it placed on their ability to expand and compete. There were inefficiencies in a system that removed price competition entirely. These criticisms were real. But the board provided something that no amount of market efficiency can provide once it is gone: a floor. A price below which milk would not be sold, below which farmers would not be paid, below which the industry would not be driven. That floor meant that being a milkman was a viable career. That floor meant that a dairy could plan its wages years in advance. That floor meant that the milkman could take out a mortgage because his employer could guarantee his wages, because the board had guaranteed the dairy's revenue. Remove the floor, and everything above it becomes uncertain. The milkman's house, his car, his holiday, all of it rested on that floor. Not because the milkman understood the economics of the milk marketing board. He probably did not think about it much at all. It was invisible to him in the way that a building's foundations are invisible to the people living in it. You do not notice the foundations when they are working. You notice them only when they fail. The board's abolition in 1994 was the foundations failing, and by the time the cracks reached the surface, the milkman's world was already gone. What made the board's collapse so consequential was not just what it did to the dairy industry in isolation. It was that the dairy industry's collapse happened at the same moment as a broader shift in the British economy, a shift that was eating away at the working-class wage structure from a completely different direction. The supermarkets that undercut the milkman on milk were the same supermarkets that were reshaping the entire retail economy, and the way they operated had implications that reached far beyond the doorstep delivery of a glass bottle. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The car the milkman drove to his depot each morning, the Ford Cortina parked outside his semi-detached house, had been affordable for a reason, and that reason is the next part of this story. Section 5. The Car. A new family saloon on a manual worker's wage. On September 21, 1962, Ford unveiled a new car at the London Motor Show. It was called the Cortina. It was a four-door family saloon with a 1.2-liter engine, room for 5 people, a boot large enough for a family's luggage, and a price tag of £573. Within months of going on sale, it was one of the best-selling cars in Britain. Within a few years, 1 in every 6 cars being built in the United Kingdom was a Cortina. Over its 20-year production run, 4.3 million examples were sold. It became, in the truest sense of the phrase, the car of ordinary British working life. The milkman drove one, or something very like it. The Mini, the Ford Anglia, the Vauxhall Victor, the Austin Cambridge. The roads of 1960s Britain were filled with modest, practical, affordable family cars that working men had bought on wages that today would not come close to covering the deposit on a vehicle of equivalent status. To understand how that was possible, start with the numbers. In 1965, a small car, a Mini or a Ford Anglia, cost around £500. A mid-sized family saloon like the early Cortina cost between £573 and £700, depending on the specification. A larger family car from Ford, Vauxhall, or Austin cost up to around £1,000. The average male manual wage in 1960 was £728 a year, rising to over £1,000 a year by the mid-1960s, as wages continued their steady upward climb. This means that the most popular family car of the era, the Cortina, the car that defined working-class motoring in Britain for 2 decades, cost less than 1 year of a manual worker's gross wages. A small car like the Mini cost roughly 8 months of annual earnings. Even the larger family saloons at the top of the affordable range cost around 1.5 times the annual wage. These are the raw numbers, but the numbers only tell part of the story. The more important question is how a working man actually bought the car, what the payment structure looked like, and whether a £14 weekly wage could realistically carry the cost. car finance existed in the 1960s in a straightforward form. A buyer would put down a deposit, typically around a third of the purchase price, and pay off the remainder in monthly installments over 1 to 2 years. On a 573-pound Cortina, a deposit of around 190 pounds and monthly payments of roughly 15 to 20 pounds over 18 months was a typical arrangement. On a 14-pound weekly wage, approximately 60 pounds a month, a car payment of 15 to 20 pounds represented roughly a quarter to a third of monthly take-home pay for the duration of the loan. That was manageable. It required discipline. It meant other spending was constrained during the payment period. But a working man with a steady job and a 14-pound weekly wage could buy Britain's best-selling family car on a payment plan without the financial structure of his life collapsing around him. Compare this to today. A mainstream new family car, the rough equivalent in the market of what the Cortina was in 1962, costs somewhere in the region of 25 to 30,000 pounds. The average annual salary in Britain in 2026 is around 37,000 pounds. That puts the modern equivalent at roughly 8 to 9 months of annual gross earnings, which on the surface looks similar to the 1960s ratio. But the surface comparison misses something important. In the 1960s, the car was one of relatively few large financial commitments a working man was carrying. His mortgage was 3 times his annual salary. His rent, if he was in a council house, was a small fraction of his income. He had no student loan. He had no childcare costs of the scale that modern families face. The NHS meant no medical bills. In the 1960s, a working man could spend a quarter of his monthly income on car payments for 18 months, because the rest of his financial life was not already consuming everything he earned. Today, a worker carrying a mortgage at 8 times their annual salary, paying private rents while saving a deposit, managing childcare costs, and servicing various other financial commitments, cannot allocate the same proportion of their income to a car payment, even if the raw ratio of car price to annual wage looks superficially similar. The car did not get dramatically more expensive relative to wages. Everything else got dramatically more expensive relative to wages, and that left less room for the car. This distinction matters enormously. The milkman's ability to afford a car in the 1960s was not solely a function of the car being cheap relative to his wages. It was a function of the car being cheap relative to his wages inside an overall financial life, where the other major costs, housing, healthcare, basic food, were also kept within reach of what he earned. Strip away the affordable housing and keep the car price the same, and suddenly the car payment becomes a stretch. Add student debt and keep the car price the same, and the car payment becomes a burden. The car's affordability in the 1960s was not a standalone fact. It was the product of an entire financial ecosystem in which working-class wages were sufficient to cover all of the basics and still have something left for a modest family car. The car industry itself also operated very differently in the 1960s from the way it operates today. Britain had a substantial domestic car manufacturing industry. Ford built the Cortina at its plant in Dagenham, Essex. Vauxhall built its cars at Luton and Ellesmere Port. BMC, British Motor Corporation, built the Mini, the Morris Minor, and a range of other popular cars at factories in Birmingham, Oxford, and across the Midlands. These factories employed hundreds of thousands of British workers on wages broadly similar to the national manual average. The car industry was one of the largest employers in manufacturing Britain, and the workers who built the cars were largely the same demographic as the workers who bought them. This created a self-reinforcing loop. Factory workers earning manual wages built cars that were priced within the reach of manual wages. The volume of production that came from building cars for the mass market kept costs down and kept prices within reach. The workers spent their wages on the cars. The car companies used those revenues to keep the factories running and the workers employed. The loop was not perfect. There were strikes, inefficiencies, and management failures throughout the 1960s British car industry, but it functioned well enough to produce a period in which car ownership expanded rapidly across the working class. At the beginning of the 1960s, car ownership was still concentrated among the middle classes and the better-paid skilled working class. By the end of the decade, it had spread substantially further down the income scale. The 1960s were the decade in which the ordinary British working man first got behind the wheel of his own car in large numbers, and the expansion of that ownership was one of the most visible signs of the rising living standards that Harold Macmillan had pointed to when he told the British public in 1957 that they had never had it so good. Running costs mattered too, and in the 1960s, they were substantially lower in real terms than they are today. Petrol cost around 8 pence per liter in the early 1970s, a figure that, even adjusted for inflation, represents a price substantially lower than the 150+ pence per liter that drivers paid in recent years. A Cortina returned somewhere between 24 and 28 miles per gallon, which by modern standards is not impressive, but the low cost of the fuel made the weekly running cost manageable for a working family. Vehicle tax, known as road tax, cost £25 per year in 1972, which adjusts to around £350 in today's money, actually higher than the £145 to £155 that modern drivers pay. Insurance was cheaper in cash terms, at around £40 a year in 1972. The overall weekly cost of running a modest family car in the 1960s and early 1970s was something a manual worker could factor into a household budget without it dominating everything else. The car also served a practical purpose that is worth stating clearly. The milkman's working day started at 4 in the morning at a depot that was not necessarily walking distance from his home. The growth of suburban housing estates, the semi-detached houses that working families were buying in growing numbers through the 1960s, had moved residential areas further from town centers and employment sites. A car was not a luxury accessory in a life organized around cheap public transport. It was becoming a practical requirement for the kind of life that working families were building. The house on the estate, the children at the local school, the weekend trip to see family in the next town. The car made that life possible, and the economics of the 1960s made the car possible. The Ford Cortina was specifically designed with this customer in mind. Ford engineers and marketing people understood that their target buyer was the ordinary British working man, the manual worker, the van driver, the milkman, the factory hand, who needed a practical, reliable, affordable family car and did not need or want luxury features that would push the price beyond his reach. The Cortina was, by the standards of any era, a fairly basic vehicle. Its interior was simple, its engine was modest, its styling was clean and contemporary, but not extravagant. Every design decision was made with the price point in mind, and the price point was set by what the target customer could afford. This is a design philosophy that has largely disappeared from the mainstream car market. Modern car manufacturers compete on features, safety technology, infotainment systems, engine sophistication, comfort and refinement, in ways that consistently push prices upward regardless of what the median worker can afford. The basic, no-frills family car, designed specifically to be within reach of a manual worker's wage, is not a product that the modern car market reliably produces. The Mini of today costs £20,000 to £30,000. The original Mini of 1959 cost less than £500, roughly 8 months of a manual worker's annual wage. Whatever the modern Mini is, it is not the same proposition. The Cortina's 20-year production run and its 4.3 million sales in Britain alone are a measure of how precisely it was calibrated to the market it served. Over 2.5 million Cortinas were sold in Britain, and despite the fact that production ended in 1982, it remains one of the 3 most popular cars ever sold in the country. That sales record is not the result of marketing or brand prestige. It is the result of a car that actually cost what ordinary working people could afford to pay, in an era when ordinary working people had enough of their wages left over, after housing, after food, after the basic costs of family life, to put something toward a car. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The milkman parked his Cortina outside his semi-detached house at the end of a working week, with the mortgage paid and the car running and the week's wages more or less accounted for. The holiday was still to come, and the holiday, like the house and the car, was not an accident. It was the product of a specific legal right that had been fought for and won decades earlier, a right that guaranteed every working person in Britain a portion of the year that belonged to them and not to their employer. Section 6. The Holiday. Butlins, Blackpool, and a week by the sea. Sometime in late July or early August, the milkman handed his round over to a colleague, packed a suitcase for himself and his family, loaded it into the Cortina, and drove to the coast. He was not alone. He was one of millions. The Great British Seaside Holiday in the 1950s and 1960s was not a niche activity for the comfortable middle classes. It was a mass event, a national migration that happened every summer with the regularity of the tides. Blackpool, Scarborough, Brighton, Margate, Southend, Torquay, Weston-super-Mare, Filey, Morecambe. These were not destinations for people with money to spare. They were destinations for ordinary working families who had saved carefully through the year, packed everything they needed into a suitcase and a boot, and made the journey to the sea as a matter of annual ritual. The milkman could afford this holiday for a reason that is easy to overlook because it is so basic. He was legally entitled to it. The holiday was not a perk that his employer chose to offer. It was not a benefit that came with a better class of job. It was a right, written into law, that applied to every worker in Britain regardless of what they did or how much they earned. That legal right had come from a piece of legislation passed in 1938 called the Holidays with Pay Act. Before this act, paid annual leave was something that some employers offered and many did not. A working man who wanted a week by the sea had to save not just the cost of the holiday but also the week's wages he would lose by not working. For most manual workers, that made a proper holiday effectively impossible. The 1938 Act changed this. It required employers to pay their workers for a defined period of annual leave, which meant that the week away from work did not have to be funded out of savings. The wages kept coming. The holiday became genuinely affordable for the first time for the broad working population. By the 1950s, 2 weeks of paid annual leave was common for most workers. By the 1960s, it was the standard expectation. The milkman did not have to choose between taking a holiday and paying his mortgage that month. The holiday was a paid week. The mortgage payment came out of the following week's wages just as it always did. The financial structure of a working-class family's year had been redesigned, by law, to make space for a break. This sounds straightforward. It is straightforward. And it is one of the clearest illustrations of the principle that runs through every section of this story. The milkman's ability to afford the things that defined a decent ordinary life was not simply the product of wages being high, it was the product of wages being high enough, and costs being controlled enough, and legal rights being strong enough, that the combination added up to something workable. Remove any one of those elements, and the combination stops working. The paid holiday was the legal element. The affordable holiday destination was the cost element, and in the 1960s, the cost of a British seaside holiday was specifically calibrated to be within reach of a working family on a manual wage. The clearest example of this calibration was the holiday camp. Billy Butlin opened his first holiday camp at Skegness in 1936. His explicit promise to the British working family was contained in one of his earliest advertising slogans: a week's holiday for a week's pay. Everything included: accommodation, 3 meals a day served in a communal dining hall, daytime activities for adults and children, and evening entertainment, all of it for the equivalent of 1 week's wages. The proposition was designed from the start around what an ordinary working man could afford to spend on a family holiday. Butlin understood his customer with precision. The working family going to Butlin's was not looking for luxury. They were looking for a complete break, for a week in which the cooking was done by someone else. The children were entertained throughout the day. The weather was less important because there was always something happening under a roof, and the cost was knowable in advance, so there were no surprises at the end of the week. Butlin delivered all of this for a price that sat directly within the range of what a working man on a manual wage could save over a year if he set aside a modest amount each week. By the 1960s, Butlin's operated 10 holiday camps across Britain. The camps at Skegness, Clacton, Filey, Ayr, Pulhelly, and Bognor Regis were among the largest, each capable of housing thousands of guests at a time. The scale of operation was enormous. New camps opened at Bognor Regis in 1960, Minehead in 1962, and Barry Island in 1966. At the peak of the holiday camp era, Butlin's alone was hosting hundreds of thousands of British families every summer season. Add the camps operated by Pontens and Warners. By 1964, Warner had 14 camps, and Pontens had started offering holidays in Mediterranean countries by 1963, and the volume of ordinary working-class families taking organized summer holidays in the 1960s was staggering. The experience inside a Butlin's camp was one that its customers remembered for the rest of their lives. The Redcoats, the staff in their red and blue uniforms, ran activities from morning to night. There were swimming pools, fairground rides, dance halls, sports facilities, and an entertainment program that ran from breakfast through to the final evening show. The dining hall served 3 meals a day at fixed times, announced through the camp's internal speaker system. The chalets were basic, small rooms with simple beds and minimal furnishings, but they were clean, they were warm, and they were beside the sea. For a family whose ordinary life involved cramped housing, long working hours, and very little time or money for entertainment, a week at Butlins was a genuine transformation of daily existence. The Redcoats themselves were a significant part of the proposition. Their job was to ensure that no guest was bored or isolated, that the children were always occupied, and that the adults always had something to do or watch or join in with. For families who spent most of the year working and managing the demands of ordinary life, being actively looked after for a week, having the entertainment brought to them rather than having to find and fund it themselves, was a specific and valued kind of rest. The working-class families who filled these camps came from industrial towns and cities across Britain. The pattern of where people went on holiday was closely connected to where they lived. From Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow, families went to Blackpool or Morecambe. From Leeds and Bradford, the destination was more likely Scarborough or Filey. From London, it was Brighton, Margate, or Southend. From Birmingham and the Midlands, it was the West Country, Weston-super-Mare, Torquay, or further into Devon and Cornwall. Many industrial towns had their own holiday week built into the local calendar. These were known as Wakes Weeks in the north of England, a tradition that stretched back to the era of the textile mills, when entire factories would shut down for maintenance during the same week each year, and the whole town would effectively empty out and head to the same resort together. The Wakes Week tradition was still strong in northern England through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Glaswegians going to Blackpool for their Wakes Week were so numerous that the city of Glasgow sent its own police officers to Blackpool to help manage the influx. This collective dimension of the British seaside holiday is something that is easy to miss when looking at it from the outside. It was not simply that individual families happened to go to the same places. It was that whole communities moved together, that the same neighbors who lived side by side all year ended up at the same resort in the same week, and that the holiday had a social texture built from shared experience rather than individual choice. The milkman and his family were not holidaying in isolation from their community. They were part of a mass movement that recreated the social world of their street in a seaside setting for a week each year. For those who chose the seaside town over the holiday camp, the economics were equally accessible. Guest houses and bed and breakfast establishments lined the seafronts of every major resort, offering rooms at prices calibrated to the budgets of their working-class guests. A family could rent a self-catering flat for the week, buy their own food from local shops, and spend their days on the beach, the pier, and the promenade. The evening entertainment at the seaside theaters and end-of-pier shows was cheap enough to be a regular part of the holiday rather than an occasional treat. If a family were in Margate in the early 1960s at the right time, they might have seen the Beatles performing as part of the summer season bill. The seaside resort in the 1960s was not a quiet retreat for the well-off. It was a loud, busy, crowded, affordable entertainment venue for the British working population. The cost of getting there mattered too, and in the 1960s the options were genuinely varied. Many families who did not yet own a car traveled by coach, the charabanc that brought Butlins guests to the camp gate. Others went by train. For families with a car, and by the mid-1960s, car ownership among working-class families was growing rapidly. The drive to the resort was part of the holiday itself. Loading the Cortina, packing the boot, and setting off on a Saturday morning was a ritual that many British children of the 1960s remember as one of the defining experiences of their early lives. The motorway network was only just beginning. The Preston Bypass, which opened in 1958, was the first stretch of motorway in Britain, and it was not much use for reaching Devon or Cornwall. A family driving from a northern industrial town to the West Country in the early 1960s was still navigating A-roads through every town and village along the route, which could make the journey a full day of driving. But the car made the journey possible on the family's own schedule, and the freedom of that, the ability to stop when the children needed to stop, to detour slightly, to carry everything needed for the week in the boot, was valued precisely because it was new. Caravanning expanded significantly during the 1960s as car ownership grew. A family that owned a car could tow a caravan to a coastal site and spend the week in their own portable accommodation, which reduced the cost of the holiday substantially compared to a guest house or a holiday camp. The caravan parks that lined the coastlines of Wales, Devon, Cornwall, and the Yorkshire coast filled every summer with families doing exactly this. The caravan holiday was the most economical version of the seaside break available to a working family with a car, and the growth in caravan ownership through the 1960s tracked almost exactly the growth in working-class car ownership. Camping holidays also became more common through the 1960s. A tent, a camping stove, and a field near the coast was within the financial reach of even the most budget-constrained working family. The camping holiday asked for very little in money terms and offered the compensating rewards of freedom, fresh air, and the genuine pleasures of coast and countryside. For families where money was particularly tight but the desire for a break was real, camping was the option that made a holiday possible when nothing else would have done. What all of these options share is the same underlying structure. The holiday was affordable because the cost of the accommodation and travel was calibrated to what ordinary working families earned. The guesthouse landladies of Blackpool and Brighton set their prices to fill their rooms, and their rooms would only fill if the prices were within reach of their working-class guests. The holiday camp operators set their prices with the same logic. The caravan sites and camping fields charged what the traffic would bear, and the traffic was ordinary working people. The entire holiday economy of coastal Britain in the 1960s was built around the spending power of the manual working class, because the manual working class was its primary customer. This is another version of the same principle that governed house prices and car prices in the same era. When the customer base for a product or service is primarily working class, and when working class wages are rising in real terms year after year, the providers of that product or service must price it within reach of those wages or lose their customers. The British seaside holiday economy of the 1960s was financially accessible to working families because working families were the people it depended on for its survival. The foreign holiday existed in the 1960s, but in a limited and still relatively expensive form. Package holidays to Mediterranean destinations, Spain, Italy, Greece, had begun to appear from the early 1960s onward, and Pontines had started offering continental options by 1963. But foreign travel was not yet the default aspiration of the British working class. Most families in the 1960s took their holiday in Britain, and most of them were genuinely content to do so. The British seaside was the known quantity. It was familiar, it was affordable, it was full of other people just like them, and it was only a few hours away by car or coach. The appeal of going abroad, of flying somewhere warm and guaranteed, was real, but it was not yet overwhelming. That would change through the 1970s and 1980s as package holidays became significantly cheaper and more accessible. The introduction of charter flights, the growth of the package holiday industry, and the falling cost of air travel gradually shifted the balance from domestic to foreign holidays. As that shift happened, the British seaside resort began its long decline. The holiday camps that had been at capacity every summer in the 1960s found themselves increasingly competing with Spanish resorts, where the sun was guaranteed and the beer was cheap. Many camps reduced in scale or closed entirely. Butland sold its Clacton and Filey camps in 1983. The era of the British holiday camp as the primary destination for the working-class family holiday was effectively over by the mid-1980s. But in the 1960s, the holiday camp was at its peak. 10 Butland's camps at maximum capacity, 25 Pontins villages, Warner running 14 camps by 1964. Hundreds of thousands of British working families spending a week each summer in a world specifically designed to give them maximum value for a week's wages. The redcoats, the dining hall, the evening show, the swimming pool, the fairground, the sea air, all of it for what a milkman earned in 7 days. The holiday completed the picture. The house at 3 times annual salary, the car at less than a year's wages, the holiday at a week's pay. 3 components of what a decent, ordinary life looked like in 1960s Britain, and 3 things that a man driving a milk float before dawn could look forward to with reasonable confidence that he would have them. This was not luck. This was not a golden age built on myths that never really existed. The numbers are real. The wages are documented. The house prices are verified. The car prices are on record. The holiday costs are established. The working man's ability to afford all 3 rested on a specific set of conditions: full employment, controlled house prices, stable wages, protected industries, legal rights to paid leave that existed in the 1960s and have been progressively dismantled since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The council housing safety net that backed all of this up, the 5 million publicly owned homes that kept rents low, kept options open for working families who had not yet bought, and put a floor beneath the housing costs of an entire social class, is where this story goes next. Because without that floor, none of the rest of it holds together the way it did. Section 7. The Council Housing Safety Net. What kept rents low for those who didn't buy on a street somewhere in Birmingham, or Leeds, or Glasgow, or any one of 100 British towns in 1962? Two men left for work at the same time every morning. One owned his house. He had saved the deposit over several years, gone to the building society, and taken out a mortgage on a 3-bedroom semi-detached. His monthly payments were manageable on his manual wage. The house was his, or would be in 15 years when the mortgage was paid off. The other man lived next door in a council house. He paid a rent set by the local council, a rent that was not designed to extract maximum profit from him, but to cover the cost of maintaining the property and building more like it. His rent was low, his home was decent. It had an indoor toilet, running hot water, central heating in many cases, and a garden for his children. He was not living in poverty. He was not living in a slum. He was living in a publicly owned home that had been built for exactly the kind of person he was. A working man on an ordinary wage who needed somewhere decent to live. These two men were not in fundamentally different economic positions. The homeowner was building equity. The council tenant was not. But the council tenant's rent was low enough that he was keeping more of his wages than the homeowner in cash terms, and he had the security of knowing that his rent would not suddenly double because the market moved against him. Both men could afford to run a car. Both men could take their families on a week's holiday. Both men were living ordinary, stable, working-class lives on wages that covered their costs. This was the reality of British housing in the 1960s that gets lost when people talk about the era. Home ownership is the part of the story that tends to get told. The affordable mortgage, the 3-times salary house price, the building society willing to lend on a single income. All of that is true, and all of it matters. But roughly a third of all housing in Britain at that time was publicly owned and rented out through local councils, and the existence of that enormous stock of decent affordable housing was a crucial part of what made ordinary working-class life financially viable. The numbers establish the scale. In 1961, Britain's council housing stock stood at 5 million homes. That is not a marginal safety net for the very poorest. That is a mainstream housing option covering a substantial portion of the entire population. By the time Right to Buy and the subsequent restrictions on council building had done their work, that stock had been reduced to 1.7 million, a figure last seen in 1961, before 2 decades of intensive building had created it. To understand how that stock came to exist in the 1960s, the story goes back to the years immediately after the Second World War. When the war ended in 1945, Britain faced a housing crisis of genuine severity. House building had essentially stopped for 6 years during the war. Bombing had destroyed or severely damaged large numbers of homes in British cities. An estimated 750,000 new houses were needed urgently. Materials and skilled labor were in short supply. The country was carrying enormous debts from the cost of fighting the war. The conditions for a housing recovery were about as difficult as they could be. The post-war Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, decided that the state would lead the building program. Local councils were given funding and a mandate to build. The target was ambitious. The result was that 1 million new homes were built in Britain between 1945 and 1955. Over 85% of those homes were social housing, council houses built to rent to working families at affordable rates. The program was not perfect, and it did not solve every problem, but it transformed the housing landscape for millions of ordinary British people in a short period of time. The building program continued through the 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s. Harold Macmillan, as housing minister in the early 1950s, set a target of building 300,000 homes a year and exceeded it. The conservative governments of the 1950s and early 1960s continued significant levels of public house building alongside growing private construction. The result was a sustained period of house building at a scale that Britain has not come close to matching since. The record was set in 1968, when Britain completed over 425,000 new homes in a single year. That record has never been beaten. The slum clearance program ran alongside the building program. In the 1950s and 1960s, 900,000 people were moved out of slums. The cramped, decaying, unheated, often shared terraced housing that had been the standard accommodation for the British urban working class since the Victorian era. They were moved into new council houses and, from the mid-1960s onward, increasingly into the concrete tower blocks that local councils were building as a fast and relatively cheap way of housing large numbers of people on small amounts of urban land. The tower blocks are now associated in the public mind with crime, neglect, and social failure. That association came later, through the 1970s and 1980s, as maintenance was cut, communities fragmented, and the stigma of council housing deepened. In the early and mid-1960s, the tower blocks were something different. They were new, they were modern, they had lifts, central heating, indoor bathrooms, and views across the city. They were an improvement, in material terms, in the basic physical quality of the accommodation, over the back-to-back terraced streets they replaced. The people who moved into them in the early 1960s were, in many cases, genuinely pleased to be there. A family moving from a Victorian terraced house without central heating and with an outdoor toilet into a new flat with hot running water and double glazing was not moving down. They were moving up. The design principles behind the best council housing of the post-war period came from a serious attempt to think about what working people deserve to live in. Aneurin Bevan, who oversaw much of the early post-war building program as Health and Housing Minister, had strong views on this. He wanted council housing to be good enough that people of all classes would choose to live in it. Not a minimum standard for the poor, but a genuine quality of accommodation that mixed communities of different income levels would inhabit together. The early council estates of the late 1940s and early 1950s, with their generous semi-detached houses, large gardens, and well-planned streets, reflected this ambition. They were not luxury homes, but they were solidly built, well-proportioned, and designed for human beings rather than for the maximum extraction of rent from the minimum amount of space. The standards dropped as the building program continued. Pressure to build quickly and cheaply led to smaller rooms, thinner walls, and eventually to the system-built tower blocks and deck access flats of the mid-1960s that aged poorly and became the problem estates of later decades. But even at their least impressive, the council homes of the 1960s represented a floor beneath working-class housing costs that kept ordinary families financially stable in a way that would have been impossible without them. The rent on a council house in the 1960s was set by the local council and was explicitly not a market rent. It was calculated to cover the cost of building and maintaining the housing stock, not to generate profit or to capture whatever tenants could be made to pay under pressure. A working family in a council house in 1965 was typically paying a rent that represented a small fraction of the household wage, far less than the equivalent accommodation would cost in the private rental market, and far less than the proportion of income that private renters pay today. This had a direct and practical effect on how far the working class wage went. A man paying a low council rent had more of his wages left for everything else: food, clothing, transport, the deposit on a mortgage if he was saving toward home ownership, the family holiday, the car payments. The low rent was not a handout. It was the result of a public investment. The original cost of building the houses had been funded by the government that was now delivering returns in the form of a working population whose basic housing costs were under control. The council housing stock also functioned as what might be called a transition mechanism. Many working families in the 1960s moved through a progression that was entirely normal and widely understood. A young couple would put their names on the council housing waiting list when they got married or had their first child. They would be housed in a council property, perhaps a flat, perhaps a small terraced house. Over the following years, they would save carefully, building up the deposit they needed for a mortgage. When the deposit was ready and their income was sufficient, they would apply to a building society, buy a house, and vacate the council property for the next family on the waiting list. This progression, council house first, save the deposit, then buy, was the path into homeownership for a large proportion of the working class families who became homeowners in the 1960s. The council house was not the permanent destination for most of the people who lived in one. It was the starting point from which the move to ownership became possible. Without it, saving a deposit while simultaneously paying a private market rent would have been much harder or impossible for many ordinary working families. The homeownership rate in Britain rose steadily through this period. Private homeownership had stood at around 10% of all households in 1914. By 1939, it had grown to around 25%. The post-war period saw it continue to rise, and by the early 1980s, it reached around 55% of all households. This 30-year growth in homeownership happened alongside the maintenance of a large council housing stock, not instead of it. The two things coexisted because the council stock enabled the transition that turned renters into owners. The 1960s also saw significant investment in the physical quality of existing council housing. Central heating was installed in older stock. Bathroom facilities were upgraded. The maintenance budgets of local councils in the 1960s, while never generous, were sufficient to keep the housing stock in reasonable repair. The people living in council houses in the 1960s were living in accommodation that was maintained and managed, not left to decay. This is the context that makes the milkman's financial life make sense in its full dimension. He might be in any one of three positions. He might own his house, having bought it with a mortgage at 3 times his annual salary. He might be in a council house, paying a low rent and saving toward a deposit. He might be in a council house with no particular plan to buy, content with the stability and affordability of what he had. In all 3 cases, his housing costs were under control. In all 3 cases, he had enough of his wages left over, after housing, to run a car and take a holiday. The destruction of this system was not an accident of history. It was a policy decision, made explicitly, with the stated intention of expanding homeownership and reducing the role of the state in housing provision. The Right to Buy scheme, introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government in 1980, allowed council tenants to buy their homes at a discount of up to 50% of the market value. The scheme was politically popular. It offered people who had been paying rent for years the chance to become owners of the home they already lived in at a substantial reduction in price. More than 1.5 million council homes were sold under Right to Buy between 1980 and 1995. The home ownership rate rose from 55% to 68% over the same period. The problem was not that people bought their council houses, the problem was what happened to the stock afterward. The law that enabled Right to Buy did not require councils to replace the homes that were sold. The receipts from the sales went to the Treasury, not back into building new council housing. Local councils were simultaneously restricted from borrowing to build new homes. The stock that took 2 decades of intensive building to create, 5 million homes by 1961, was sold off without replacement. The homes that were sold tended to be the most desirable ones. The solid semi-detached houses with gardens on well-maintained estates were the homes that tenants wanted to buy. The deck-access flats and tower blocks that nobody wanted to buy remained in council ownership. Over time, the council housing stock became concentrated in the least desirable properties in the least desirable locations, which deepened the stigma of council housing and accelerated the departure of those who could afford to leave. By the time the full scale of the damage was visible, the council housing stock had fallen from 5 million homes in 1961 to 1.7 million, precisely the level it had been before the post-war building program had created the safety net in the first place. 60 years of building, followed by a sale and a restriction on replacement that unwound it in roughly 2 decades. The effect on working-class housing costs was direct and severe. With fewer council homes available, the waiting lists grew. Families who would previously have been housed in the council stock were instead pushed into the private rental market. Private landlords, facing increased demand and reduced competition from the council sector, raised rents. The proportion of a working household's income going to housing, whether in rent or mortgage payments, climbed steadily. Today, private renters in Britain typically spend between 30% and 40% of their income on rent in most parts of the country, and significantly more than that in London and the Southeast. A working man in a council house in 1965 was spending a fraction of that. The difference is not a small adjustment in the cost of living. It is a fundamental change in the financial structure of working-class life. The council housing stock was the part of the 1960s system that is least often discussed when people talk about the milkman's affordability. The mortgage story gets told, the wage growth story gets told, the holiday story gets told. The council house tends to be left out, perhaps because it is associated in the modern mind with later failures, the neglected estates, the tower block disasters, the stigma that attached itself to social housing through the 1970s and 1980s. But in the 1960s, the council house was not a symbol of failure. It was a symbol of what the state could do when it decided that housing was a public responsibility, rather than a market commodity. 5 million decent homes, maintained and rented at affordable rates, providing a floor beneath the housing costs of roughly a third of the British population. That floor was what made it possible for a working man to save for a mortgage, or simply to live decently on a manual wage without spending the majority of it on shelter. The floor was built deliberately. It was removed deliberately. And in its absence, the financial arithmetic of working-class life has never been the same. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The house, the car, the holiday, the council housing safety net, all of these pieces of the milkman's world have now been examined. But there is a force that has been running beneath all of them, shaping every one of them, that has not yet been named directly: the supermarket. The institution that arrived in Britain in the 1960s in its modern form, began its expansion through the 1970s, and ended up reshaping not just where people bought their milk, but the entire structure of the working-class economy. What the supermarket did, how it did it, and what it took with it in its rise to dominance is where this story goes next. Section 8. The supermarket arrives, the force that eventually dismantled it all. In 1960, there were no supermarkets in Britain. Not in the form that the word means today. There were grocers. There were butchers, bakers, fishmongers, and greengrocers. There were cooperative stores that had been part of working-class community life since the 19th century. There were larger grocery chains, Sainsbury's, Tesco, Lipton's, that operated multiple shops across different towns and cities. But these were counter-service shops mostly. You walked in, you told the person behind the counter what you wanted, they fetched it and wrapped it, and you paid and left. The shopping was done across multiple shops, each one specializing in a different category of food. The butcher for meat, the baker for bread, the greengrocer for vegetables, the dairy for milk, though in most cases the milk came to you rather than requiring a trip to a shop at all. By 1965, there was one supermarket in Britain in the modern sense, one large self-service store where a customer could walk in and find food from multiple categories all in one place, pick items off shelves themselves, and pay at a single checkout. By 1970, there were 16. By 1975, there were 70. By 1980, there were 280. By 1990, there were 775. That trajectory, from zero to nearly 800 large self-service stores in 30 years, is one of the most consequential economic shifts in 20th century Britain, and it happened almost entirely within the working lifetime of the 1960s milkman. The mechanism that made this expansion possible began in 1964. That year, the government abolished something called resale price maintenance, a system of agreements between manufacturers and retailers that required goods to be sold at a minimum set price. Under this system, a tin of baked beans cost the same in every shop, because the manufacturer had set the price, and every retailer was legally required to charge it. When resale price maintenance was abolished, retailers were free to sell goods at whatever price they chose. A large retailer who bought in enormous quantities from a manufacturer could negotiate a lower purchase price, sell the goods more cheaply than smaller competitors, and attract more customers on the basis of lower prices. This was the moment that gave the large supermarket chains their fundamental competitive advantage over every smaller retailer in Britain. The bigger the retailer, the more they bought. The more they bought, the lower the price they could negotiate with suppliers. The lower the price they paid, the cheaper they could sell. The cheaper they sold, the more customers they attracted. The more customers they attracted, the bigger they became. The cycle fed itself, and it fed it at the direct expense of every small shop, every specialist retailer, and every community-based grocery operation that could not match the buying power of a national chain. Jack Cohen, who had founded Tesco, operated on an explicit motto: pile it high and sell it cheap. It was a philosophy that made perfect sense in the context of a retail landscape that had just been freed from fixed pricing. Cohen's business model was volume: buy more than anyone else, sell cheaper than anyone else, build more stores than anyone else. During the 1950s and 1960s, Tesco grew by buying up smaller chains. It purchased 200 Harrow Stores outlets in 1959, 212 Irwin's shops in 1960, and 97 Charles Phillips shops in 1964. By the end of the 1960s, Tesco owned more than 800 shops across Britain, with the larger ones beginning to operate as full self-service supermarkets. Sainsbury's was moving in the same direction. In 1961, It became the first food retailer in Britain to computerize its distribution system, an early signal of the operational sophistication that would give the large chains an increasing advantage over smaller competitors in the decades ahead. The self-service model spread throughout Sainsbury's stores during the 1960s. The counter where a customer had once asked a member of staff to fetch items was replaced by shelves the customer walked through themselves, selecting items and placing them in a basket or trolley. The self-service model required less staff per customer served. A counter service grocer needed a person behind the counter to fetch, wrap, and handle every item for every customer. A self-service supermarket needed people to stock shelves, manage checkouts, and handle the store, but the ratio of staff to customers was far lower. This reduced the labor cost per unit sold, which contributed to the lower prices the supermarkets could offer. The efficiency of the self-service model was real. It was also the reason that the expansion of supermarkets was accompanied by the contraction of employment in food retail. The same number of customers required fewer workers to serve them. By 1969, 5 years after the abolition of fixed pricing, there were reported to be 3,400 supermarkets of various sizes across Britain. The number includes smaller self-service stores as well as the large out-of-town operations that would come to define the supermarket landscape of the 1980s and 1990s, but it illustrates how quickly the retail landscape transformed once the pricing restriction was removed. In less than a decade, the way Britain bought its food changed fundamentally. For the Milkman, the consequences of this transformation were visible from the beginning, even if the full scale of what was coming was not yet clear. The critical moment arrived in 1961. Robert Wiseman Dairies, inspired by developments in the United States, began selling milk packaged in Tetra Brick cartons through supermarkets. This was a direct challenge to the glass bottle on the doorstep. The carton milk in a supermarket was cheaper than the delivered milk from the Milkman. The customer picking up bread and vegetables at their local supermarket could add a carton of milk to their basket without any additional trip, any additional cost, or any additional arrangement. The doorstep delivery began, from that moment, what would prove to be an irreversible decline. In 1966, around 100,000 people worked in the supply of milk in Britain. By the early 1980s, there were around 40,000 milkmen, and 86% of milk was still delivered to the door. By 1989, 15 million homes were still served by 34,000 milkmen. These numbers, read in sequence, tell the story of a slow but continuous erosion, a gradual reduction in the number of milkmen and the percentage of milk they delivered, running alongside the expansion of supermarket milk sales year by year through the 1970s and 1980s. The erosion accelerated sharply after 1994, when the Milk Marketing Board was abolished and supermarkets were free to price milk at whatever level they chose. With the board gone and the controlled pricing structure removed, supermarkets used milk as what is known in retail as a loss leader. A loss leader is a product sold at or below the cost of producing and delivering it, specifically to attract customers into the store. The supermarket does not need to make money on the milk itself. The milk is the reason the customer walks through the door. Everything else in the basket, the bread, the biscuits, the cleaning products, the ready meals, is where the profit comes from. The milkman had no basket. He sold milk, and he sold some additional dairy goods, and that was his product range. He could not subsidize the price of milk with profits from 20 other categories. When the supermarket sold a 4-pint plastic container of milk for less than what the milkman charged for the same volume in glass bottles, the milkman had no answer that did not involve selling at a loss himself. Only 3% of milk in Britain is now delivered to the door. That figure, set against the 86% delivered by milkmen in the early 1980s, is the measure of what supermarket pricing produced once the price controls were removed. The 800 milkmen reduced to the fraction that remains are the last survivors of an industry that once employed 100,000 people and covered virtually every street in the country. But the damage the supermarket did to the working-class economy of the 1960s milkman runs considerably deeper than the destruction of the milk round. The supermarket's rise reshaped the entire structure of the working-class economy in ways that affected wages, employment, community, and the basic cost of living, in ways that the milkman and his neighbors felt across every dimension of their lives. The high street that existed in every British town in the 1960s was a collection of independent and small chain shops, each one employing a small number of people at wages broadly consistent with the manual working norm. The butcher employed 2 or 3 people. The baker employed a small team. The greengrocer, the fishmonger, the hardware shop, the haberdashery, each one was a small employer embedded in the local community, paying wages that circulated within that community, drawing its customers from the surrounding streets, and providing a set of jobs that were accessible to people without specialist skills or qualifications. As supermarkets expanded, this landscape was dismantled. The supermarket did not simply add itself to an existing retail ecosystem, it replaced large parts of that ecosystem. The independent butcher could not compete with a supermarket's meat counter on price. The independent greengrocer could not compete with a supermarket's produce section on price or range. One by one, the specialist shops of the British High Street closed, and their customers moved to the supermarket. The jobs that were lost in the specialist shops were not fully replaced by the jobs created in the supermarkets. Supermarket work in its early decades was overwhelmingly part-time, predominantly female, and paid at or near the minimum level acceptable. The full-time, skilled work of a trained butcher or baker, paid at a rate that reflected the skill involved, was replaced by part-time shelf stacking and checkout work, paid at the lowest acceptable rate. The total number of workers in food retail did not collapse. Supermarkets employed large numbers of people, but the quality and pay level of those jobs shifted downward. The location of the supermarket also mattered in ways that damaged working-class communities. The large out-of-town supermarkets that became the dominant model from the 1970s onward were built on cheap land outside town centers, accessible primarily by car. They were not designed to serve pedestrian communities. They were designed to serve car-owning households who could drive to them, load a large weekly shop into a boot, and drive home. The communities without cars, which, in the 1960s and 1970s, were disproportionately the poorest working-class communities, were not well served by this model. As the high street shops closed and out-of-town supermarkets replaced them, the cost of food for households without cars went up relative to households with cars. A family that could drive to the large out-of-town supermarket accessed the lowest prices. A family dependent on what remained of the local high street, or on the smaller, more expensive in-town supermarket format that emerged later, paid more for the same goods. The communities least able to absorb higher food costs were the ones least well served by the supermarket model. The impact on dairy farming, which flows directly into the Milkman story, has already been told in Section 4. But it is worth placing that impact inside the broader picture of what the supermarket did to the food supply chain as a whole, because the dairy industry was not a special case. It was an example of a general pattern. The supermarket's buying power allowed it to squeeze suppliers across every category of food. Farmers growing vegetables, raising pigs and chickens, producing cheese and butter and cream, all of them faced the same pressure that dairy farmers faced once the board was gone. The supermarket negotiated the price. The farmer accepted what was offered or lost the contract. The price offered was set at the lowest level the supermarket believed it could sustain while keeping the farmer producing. At various points across various categories, that price fell below the cost of production, and farms failed. The number of farms in Britain fell continuously through the second half of the 20th century. The farms that remained grew larger as the smaller ones were absorbed or abandoned. The agricultural employment that had supported rural communities shrank. The processing and packing jobs that had existed around smaller, more locally distributed food supply chains were consolidated into large central facilities. The food system became more efficient in terms of cost per unit, and the efficiency gains flowed primarily to the supermarket's shareholders and to the customer in the form of lower prices, rather than to the workers and farmers who produced the food. This is the paradox at the heart of the supermarket story. The lower prices that supermarkets offered were real. A family shopping at Tesco in 1975 could buy their weekly groceries more cheaply in cash terms than they could from the collection of specialist shops it replaced. This was a genuine benefit to working-class households whose budgets were tight. The argument that supermarkets were bad for working people is complicated by the fact that, at the point of purchase, they made food cheaper. The complication is that the lower prices came at a cost that was paid elsewhere in the system, by the farmers who received less for what they produced, by the specialist retail workers who lost better jobs and replaced them with worse ones, by the working-class communities whose high streets emptied and whose social infrastructure of local commerce declined, and by the milkmen whose protected income structure was first undermined by supermarket milk and then destroyed by the removal of the price controls that had kept the industry viable. The cost was also paid in the wages of supermarket workers themselves. The large supermarket chains became, by the 1990s and 2000s, among the largest private sector employers in Britain. They employed hundreds of thousands of people. Those people were, in the main, working-class people doing physically demanding jobs, stacking shelves, operating checkouts, managing warehouses, for wages that sat near the bottom of the national pay scale. The supermarket had replaced a landscape of small employers paying broadly average manual wages, with a landscape dominated by a small number of enormous employers paying near minimum wages to a largely part-time workforce. The milkman of the 1960s had job security, a stable income, a career structure that could last 30 to 40 years, and community connections that made his work meaningful beyond the wage it paid. The supermarket worker of the 2000s had a 0-hours contract, a wage at the minimum legal level, no particular guarantee that their hours would be consistent from week to week, and a job from which the community dimension had been almost entirely removed. The transaction at a supermarket checkout is not a relationship. It is a commercial exchange. The milkman's relationship with the people on his round was something altogether different. All of this accumulation, the loss of the milk round, the closure of the high street, the squeeze on suppliers, the replacement of skilled specialist retail jobs with low-paid part-time work, the removal of the price controls that had kept the dairy industry viable, happened gradually, over several decades, and no single moment announced itself as the turning point. But running beneath all of it was a consistent direction of travel. The market was being freed, the protections were being removed, the floors were being lifted, and every time a floor was lifted, the people who had been standing on it fell. The milkman stood on several floors simultaneously. The Milk Marketing Board's price floor, the full employment floor that kept wages rising, the council housing floor that kept rents low, the affordable house price floor maintained by controlled mortgage lending, the legal floor of paid annual leave that made the holiday possible. These floors did not fall at the same time. They fell in sequence, over roughly 50 years, each one going at a different moment for a different stated reason. The housing controls eased in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The council stock was sold off from 1980. The Milk Marketing Board was abolished in 1994. The trade union structures that had maintained collective wage bargaining were weakened through the 1980s legislation. Full employment gave way to the managed unemployment of the Thatcher era, when the government explicitly accepted a higher unemployment rate as the cost of reducing inflation. Each fall was presented as progress. Each removal of a floor was described as freeing the market, increasing efficiency, giving people more choice, or creating a more dynamic economy. Some of those descriptions had elements of truth in them. Markets freed from price controls did produce innovation and variety in some areas. Homeownership did increase when council tenants were given the right to buy. Supermarkets did make food cheaper at the point of purchase. The question that did not get asked loudly enough, or answered honestly enough, was what was lost in each exchange, what disappeared when the floor was removed, who paid the cost that the efficiency gain did not capture, the farmer who produced milk below cost, the milkman whose career dissolved, the council tenant who found no council house available, the working-class family whose housing costs doubled as a proportion of their income, the high street community whose social fabric unraveled as the shops closed one by one. The milkman's world was built on floors. The supermarket and the broader economic transformation it represented was in the business of removing them. What that process has produced, measured in the concrete terms of what a working person can afford today, compared to what their grandfather could afford in 1962, is where the story ends. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that ending, the structural conditions that closed the door on the milkman's life, and why those specific conditions have never been rebuilt, is the final account this dispatch owes. Section 9. The structural conditions that made it all possible, and why they no longer exist. There is a number that sits at the center of this entire story. In 1966, 8.9 million people in Britain worked in manufacturing industries. In 2016, that number was 2.9 million. In 50 years, the country lost 6 million manufacturing jobs, roughly two-thirds of the entire industrial workforce that had existed at the peak. That is not a footnote to the story of why the milkman could afford a house, a car, and a holiday. That is the story, because the milkman's world was not built on milk. It was built on the broader economy that surrounded him. The full employment economy, the rising wages economy, the industrial economy that needed workers badly enough to pay them decently and keep them employed consistently. When that economy was dismantled, piece by piece, the milkman's world went with it. Not immediately, not all at once, but with the same inevitability as a building whose foundations are being removed one by one while the people living in it are told the work is progress. To understand why the structural conditions of the 1960s no longer exist, it is necessary to understand clearly what those conditions actually were, not as a general feeling of prosperity, not as a nostalgic impression of a better time, but as specific, documented, measurable facts about the economy that working people lived inside. The first condition was full employment, and it was real in a way that has not been sustained in Britain since the early 1970s. Across the 1960s, unemployment in Britain averaged 2.7%. This is a figure so low that modern economists regard it as effectively full employment, the irreducible minimum of people between jobs at any given moment, rather than a genuine surplus of workers unable to find work. The annual rate of growth between 1960 and 1973 averaged 2.9%. That growth was not spectacular by international standards. France, West Germany, and Italy all grew faster in the same period, but it was consistent, and it translated directly into jobs. There were not enough workers to fill available positions. Employers competed for workers rather than the other way around. This matters enormously for wages. When employers need workers more than workers need any particular employer, wages go up. Workers can leave one job and find another. They can organize through trade unions and demand better pay, without fearing that the employer will simply replace them from a large pool of unemployed people willing to work for less. The full employment of the 1960s was the foundation on which everything else the working class had been built rested. It was what gave the trade unions their power. It was what made collective wage bargaining work. It was what ensured that the economic growth of the decade translated into rising wages at the bottom of the income scale rather than simply accumulating at the top. The labor shortages in manufacturing and transport in the 1960s were severe enough that the British government actively encouraged immigration from Commonwealth countries, from the Caribbean, from India, from Pakistan, to fill the gap. These new workers came because there was work. There was work because the economy needed more workers than Britain alone could supply. The full employment of the 1960s was not a policy achievement alone. It was the product of a specific moment in global economic history when the reconstruction of Europe after the war, combined with the expansion of manufacturing industry, combined with the social commitments of post-war governments to maintain high levels of employment, produced a labor market that genuinely favored the worker. The second condition was real wage growth. In the 1960s, real wages, the actual purchasing power of what workers earned, after accounting for the rising cost of living, grew at 3% a year. This is a figure that the LSE's analysis of British wages from 1964 to 2023 identifies as the highest sustained rate of real wage growth in that entire 60-year period. The 1970s saw real wage growth of 5.5% per year, driven partly by inflation-chasing pay demands from trade unions. The 1980s saw 4.4%, the 1990s saw 1.6%, the 2000s saw 1.7%, the 2010s and early 2020s saw essentially zero, the longest period of real wage stagnation in over 160 years of comparable records. The trajectory is unmistakable. The pace of real wage growth has declined in almost every decade since the 1960s, and in the most recent period it has stopped entirely. A worker today earns more in cash than their grandfather earned in 1963. The average weekly wage of £668 in 2023 is 4.2 times higher in cash than the £161 average of 1963. But cash comparisons mean nothing without reference to what that cash buys. And what cash buys has been determined, for the working class majority, primarily by the cost of housing, which has risen far faster than wages, and by the cost of the other basics of ordinary life, which have also risen faster than wages in most of the relevant categories. The third condition was the manufacturing employment base itself. The 8.9 million manufacturing workers of 1966 were not all high-skilled, high-paid specialists. Many of them were doing relatively straightforward physical work, operating machinery, assembling components, processing materials, that did not require extensive qualifications or years of training. What it required was showing up, working consistently, and being part of an organized workforce that negotiated collectively for its wages and conditions. The manufacturing sector provided stable, full-time employment at broadly average manual wages to a very large number of people who had no particular educational advantage. It was the employment base of the ordinary working class. As manufacturing employment declined from the mid-1960s onward, and as the decline accelerated sharply through the early 1980s, the question of what would replace it became increasingly urgent. The answer that the British economy provided was the service sector: retail, hospitality, cleaning, care work, administrative support. These jobs employed large numbers of people, but they employed them differently from manufacturing: part-time rather than full-time, lower wages, less union organization, less job security, less consistency of hours. The transition from a manufacturing-based working-class economy to a service-based one was not a neutral swap of one type of employment for another. It was a downward shift in the quality, pay, and security of the jobs available to people without specialist qualifications. The milkman of the 1960s was a manual worker in a protected industry, employed full-time, with job security backed by price controls on his product, in a labor market where his employer needed him more than he needed his employer. The retail worker of the 2000s was a part-time worker in a competitive industry, employed on variable hours, with no price protection on the products they sold, in a labor market where their employer had access to a large pool of people who needed work badly enough to accept minimum wages and 0-hours contracts. These are not the same economic position with different job titles. They are structurally different positions in two entirely different kinds of economy. The fourth condition was the welfare state in its full operational form. The National Health Service meant that a working family did not need to budget for medical costs. A child's illness, a broken bone, a hospital procedure, none of these events created a financial crisis for an ordinary household in the 1960s. This is easy to understate because the NHS still exists. But the NHS of the 1960s was a more fully resourced institution relative to the demand placed on it than it became in later decades. Waiting times were shorter. GP access was more immediate. The service did what it promised. It removed medical cost from the household budget of every working family in the country, without exception, as a matter of universal right. The welfare state also included the unemployment benefit system, which in the 1960s was sufficient to prevent genuine destitution for a working family that lost its income temporarily. The benefit was not generous. Nobody chose to be unemployed in the 1960s for financial comfort, but it was adequate to cover basic costs for the period between losing one job and finding another, a period that, in a full employment economy with a 2.7% unemployment rate, tended to be short. The combination of low unemployment and adequate benefit provision meant that the risk of catastrophic financial failure for a working family in the 1960s was genuinely lower than it is for the equivalent family today. The fifth condition, which runs beneath all the others, was the trade union movement at the peak of its influence. In the 1960s, trade union membership in Britain was high, and collective bargaining covered the majority of the workforce in most industries. The milkman's wages were not set in a one-to-one negotiation between him and his employer, in which the employer held all the advantages of capital and the worker held only the option of leaving. They were set through collective agreements in which the union representing workers in the dairy industry negotiated with the employers on behalf of all workers together. Collective bargaining worked because it changed the power relationship between the worker and the employer. A single worker refusing to accept a low-wage offer is easily replaced. A workforce acting together is not. When the dairy workers collectively refused a wage offer, the dairy faced the prospect of losing all its workers simultaneously, a prospect far more damaging than losing one. This leverage translated into wages that tracked the broader economic conditions more closely than individual workers, negotiating alone, would have been able to achieve. The weakening of the trade union movement through the legislative changes of the 1980s, restrictions on strike action, requirements for balloting, limits on secondary action, and the broader climate of antagonism between the government and the unions, removed this leverage systematically. Union membership fell, collective bargaining coverage shrank. Individual workers found themselves negotiating alone against employers who had, in many sectors, a large pool of available labor to draw from. The wages of the bottom half of the income distribution, which had been rising in real terms through the 1960s and 1970s, partly because of union power, began their long relative decline. All five conditions, full employment, real wage growth, manufacturing employment, the welfare state, and trade union power, existed simultaneously in the 1960s. They reinforced each other. Full employment made unions powerful. Powerful unions drove wage growth. Wage growth fueled the consumer demand that kept manufacturing employment high. High manufacturing employment kept unemployment low. The welfare state removed catastrophic costs from household budgets, making working-class wages go further. The system was not designed as a system. It was not the product of a single plan or a single government. It was the accumulated result of policy choices made across several decades, from the creation of the NHS in 1948 to the full employment commitments of successive post-war governments to the industrial relations framework that made collective bargaining the dominant way wages were set. What it produced, in the 1960s, was an economy in which a man driving a milk float before dawn was not struggling. He was not rich. He was not comfortable in the way that word is used today. He did not have 2 cars, 3 holidays, or a pension pot. But he had 1 car. He had 1 house. He had 1 week by the sea each year. And those 3 things, the car, the house, the holiday, were within reach of his wage because the system he lived inside had been built, deliberately, to make them reachable. The system has been rebuilt since, but in a different direction. The floors have been removed. The protections have been lifted. The markets have been freed. The result, measured in the concrete terms of what a working person can afford today compared to what their grandfather could afford in 1962, is a Britain in which the milkman's life is impossible to recreate on a milkman's wage. A milk delivery worker today, the small number who still exist, serving the 3% of households that still take doorstep delivery, earns on average around $40,000 a year in the United States, where some doorstep delivery still operates commercially. In Britain, the comparable role, where it exists at all, pays at or near the national living wage. The house that costs 8 times annual earnings. The car that costs what it always did relative to wages, but sits inside a financial life where housing has consumed the headroom that used to make the car affordable. The holiday that is still technically possible, but competes for budget space with a rent or mortgage that takes 30 to 40% of household income rather than the 10 to 15% that the council house or the 1960s mortgage demanded. The milkman of the 1960s did not know he was living through a golden age. He knew his round, his customers, his float, and his family. He knew that his wages were going up every year and that the house was being paid off and that there was money set aside for the summer. He did not have a name for the system that made all of that possible. He just lived inside it and took it, if not for granted, then at least as the expected shape of an ordinary working life. The name for that system, assembled from everything in this story, is simply this: an economy in which the people at the bottom were not left to the mercy of the market in the things that mattered most: housing, employment, wages, healthcare. The basic costs of an ordinary life were managed, by policy, to remain within the reach of the people who did the work that kept everything running. When that management ended, when the market was left to set the price of everything without the floors and controls that had kept prices connected to wages, the milkman's life became a memory rather than a possibility. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The last piece of this story is the accounting. The specific numbers that show, in direct comparison, exactly what changed and how much it cost. The before and the after laid out plainly, so that the gap between the milkman's world and the present one can be seen not as a feeling or an impression, but as a set of facts. Section 10. What actually changed, the specific mechanisms that closed the door. The numbers do not lie. They do not require interpretation or political opinion to land with weight. They are simply what happened, measured and recorded, sitting in the public record for anyone who wants to look at them honestly. Start with the house. In 1960, the average house in Britain cost £2,263. The average male manual worker earned £728 a year. The house cost 3.1 times the annual wage. A building society would lend 2.5 to 3 times annual income on a single wage, require a deposit of roughly 10%, and offer a 15 to 20-year mortgage. The monthly payments on that mortgage were manageable on £14 a week. A working man on an ordinary manual wage could buy a house, alone, on his income, without his wife working, without help from his parents, and without spending the following decade unable to afford anything else. In 2024, the average house in Britain cost approximately £274,000. The average annual earnings for a full-time worker were approximately £35,000. The house cost 7.8 times the annual wage. A mortgage lender today will typically offer 4 to 4.5 times annual income, require a deposit of at least 10%, which on a £274,000 house is £27,400, and offer a 25 to 35-year term. On average earnings, saving that deposit while paying rent takes years. The mortgage payments on a house at that price, at the interest rates of recent years, consume a proportion of monthly take-home pay that leaves far less room for everything else. The ratio moved from 3 times annual earnings to nearly 8 times annual earnings. A working person today needs to accumulate almost 3 times as many years of their income to buy the average house as their grandfather did in 1960. That is the single largest structural change in the financial life of the British working class over the past 60 years. And everything else in this story, the car, the holiday, the career, the sense that ordinary work could build an ordinary decent life, has been made harder by it. Now the car. In 1962, the Ford Cortina cost £573. The average manual wage was £728 a year. The car cost 78% of 1 year's earnings, roughly 9.5 months of gross wages. Car finance over 18 months at a deposit of around a third was manageable on a £14 weekly wage. Today, the mainstream family car that most directly occupies the same market position as the 1962 Cortina costs somewhere between £25,000 and £30,000. Average annual earnings are around £37,000. The ratio is broadly similar, roughly 8 to 9 months of annual earnings for the entry-level version. On the surface, this looks like the car has not become less affordable relative to wages. The surface is misleading. In 1962, the man buying the Cortina was also paying a mortgage at 3 times his annual salary. His rent, if he was still in a council house, was a small fraction of his income. He had no student debt, he had no childcare costs at modern levels. His healthcare was free and fully functional. His housing costs, whether owned or rented, consumed a modest share of his monthly income. He had room in his financial life for a car payment. Today, the worker buying the equivalent car is carrying a mortgage at nearly 8 times their annual salary, or paying a private rent that takes 30 to 40% of their monthly income. The housing cost alone has consumed the financial headroom that made the car payment possible in 1962. The car ratio looks the same. The surrounding financial life that determines whether that ratio is manageable has transformed completely. Now the holiday. Butlins advertised its holiday camps with an explicit promise: a week's holiday for a week's pay. In the 1960s, a week at a Butlins camp, accommodation, 3 meals a day, full entertainment program, cost the equivalent of 1 week's wages for a working man. The legal right to paid annual leave, established in law in 1939 and extended to 2 weeks by the 1950s, meant that week's pay still came in while the family was at the seaside. The holiday cost nothing from the annual wage beyond what was already being earned. The equivalent family holiday today, a package in a comparable holiday resort, covering a family of 4 for 1 week with accommodation and meals, costs somewhere between £1,000 and £2,000 depending on destination and timing. The average weekly wage in Britain in 2023 was £668. A week's family holiday costs between 1.5 and 3 weeks of average earnings. Legal paid leave entitlement today stands at 28 days per year for a full-time worker, which is more generous than the 2 weeks common in the 1960s. The holiday can still be taken on paid leave, but it now costs more relative to wages, and it competes for budget space with housing costs that were not making the same demands in the 1960s. Now the milk round itself. In 1966, 100,000 people worked in the supply of milk. In 1983, there were 40,000 milkmen, and 86% of all milk was delivered to the door. In 1989, 15 million homes were still served by 34,000 milkmen. Today, 3% of milk in Britain is delivered to the door. The workforce that delivered it has declined to a fraction of what it was. The career structure that kept a milkman on the same round for 30 to 40 years, earning a stable income in a protected industry, has largely ceased to exist. The Milk Marketing Board, which guaranteed the price of milk from farm to doorstep for 60 years, was abolished in October 1994. In the years that followed, the price paid to dairy farmers fell by 28%. Supermarkets began selling milk at or below the cost of production as a way of attracting customers. The farms that had been viable under the guaranteed price system found themselves unable to cover costs. The number of dairy farms in England and Wales, which had peaked at 162,000 in 1950, fell continuously and sharply after 1994. The milk round, the dairy farm, and the stable working-class career that connected them, all three casualties of a single policy decision to remove a price floor that had worked for 6 decades. Now the council housing stock. In 1961, the council housing stock in Britain stood at 5 million homes. Roughly a third of all housing was publicly owned and rented at below-market rates to ordinary working families. The Right to Buy scheme, introduced in 1980, sold over 1.5 million of those homes by 1995. The law that enabled the sell-off did not require replacement. The 5 million homes of 1961 became 1.7 million, precisely the level the stock had been before 2 decades of intensive building had created it. The waiting list that had once been a manageable queue toward decent affordable housing became years-long in most areas, pushing families into private rents they could not easily afford. Now the wages. In the 1960s, real wages grew at 3% per year, the highest sustained rate in the 60 years of comparable records that run from 1964 to 2023. That growth rate slowed through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. In the 2010s and early 2020s, it reached zero, the longest sustained period of real wage stagnation in over 160 years of records. The cash figure on a modern pay packet is larger than the cash figure on a 1963 pay packet. The purchasing power of that cash, measured against the costs that matter most to working-class life, housing, transport, family basics, has not kept pace. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, homes in Britain could be bought for less than 5 times average annual earnings. By 2024, the ratio had reached nearly 8 times. A working person today needs roughly double the years of earnings to buy a house, compared to someone in the same relative position in 1968. That doubling has not been offset by any other compensating improvement in the financial position of the working class. Wages have grown in cash terms. The house price has grown faster. The gap has widened in every decade since the early 1970s, and it is wider now than at any point in the period for which reliable comparable records exist. These are the specific mechanisms: the house price ratio that tripled, the council stock that was sold without replacement, the Milk Marketing Board that was abolished, and the milk price that fell 28% without it, the manufacturing employment base that shrank from 8.9 million to 2.9 million workers, the real wage growth that slowed to nothing, the trade union power that was legislated away, the out-of-town supermarket that replaced the high street employer and the specialist retail worker with part-time minimum wage work. None of these changes happened by accident. Each one was a decision. Each decision had a stated rationale. The rationale was, in almost every case, some version of the same argument, that freeing the market, removing the controls, ending the protections, would produce a more efficient economy that would ultimately be better for everyone. The milkman's world is the measure of what that argument cost. A man doing ordinary work, contributing something genuinely useful to his community, every single morning before the sun came up, living a life that included a house, a car, and a holiday. That combination was not the product of exceptional luck or extraordinary wages. It was the product of an economy that had been built, deliberately, around the principle that ordinary work deserved an ordinary decent life. When the building was taken apart, the life it had housed went with it. And the question of whether it can be rebuilt, whether the floors can be put back, whether the conditions that made the milkman's world possible can be recreated in some form that fits the economy of today, is the question that the entire story has been building toward. That question does not have a simple answer, but it has a clear starting point. Every single element of the milkman's affordability, the house, the car, the holiday, the job security, the rising wages, was produced by specific policy choices, not by luck, not by a uniquely generous era that could never be repeated, by choices. Which means that different choices, made deliberately and sustained consistently, could produce different outcomes. The floors were built once, they could be built again. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.